I would be interested in is the idea that when you want to describe movement on a larger scale, so just, for example, don't take like a singular natural event that occurs, but instead take something of an entire set of configurations that is moving towards some other kind of configuration, then how do you apply these modal categories to this kind of thing? For example, as you can see here on a scene, right? The scene is composed of a lot of things. So you have a lot of actors that are involved in it, and you have something like a stage, like a spatial surrounding or an environment. And you have spatio-temporal aspects, right? You have a dimensional expansion in space and time, and you have the things that each of these actors are doing separately, and you have maybe the movements that they are doing by themselves, but also the movements that are interrelated, that you could describe as taking place within a certain segment of space-time from different actors. So there's really a lot involved in a scene, not just a thing or a plan or a substance that you would predicate those modal categories from. So the question that I was just going to ask is, suppose you wanted to describe movement or the change of things on a larger scale, not just on the scale of individual things, but say context-wise within a scene, right? Where the actors can do different things next. They can behave in different ways. They can, if you think about it aesthetically even, they can choose to play certain roles or others, and therefore make something else, something entirely different out of the same scene. And somehow you still would want to attribute those modal categories to the scenery, right? Or to the scene. You would want to say that some things are possible, some things aren't. And yet there's always that sense, that aesthetic sense, that what is possible coming from a certain scene is not limited to the scene itself, or not obvious if you just look at it. So if you look at this picture, for example, not everything that could happen in relation to this scene is already contained within it, right? You could have some other people coming in from the side, or you could have a gate closing or a window or anything like that. So you could have all kinds of things happen within that certain scene, and you could describe the change that has happened through using or by using those modal categories, but it's somehow different than attributing them to individual things, or at least that's my idea. And I thought it would maybe be interesting, from a Kierkegaardian perspective, but we don't have to, of course, we are free to go on by ourselves. This aesthetic notion that by describing an environment or a scene, you get such a complex entity, right? It's not just a thing, it's not just a set of elements, but instead it's already a contexted assortment of things that do have some kind of very special and complex relations among them already, which you then all take together and observe and see how through changing something in the scene or changing the entire scene, you get a result from it that maybe can tell you something about the complexity of the relations that were already involved in making up the scene in the first place. So those were just some input thoughts from my side, because the title is, of course, things. So you can talk about things in like a very specific analytic manner, meaning really things like confined individual substances, and then you can take them out of their natural context, or even just abstractly speak about them and describe their relations. But you can also take things in plural, meaning it quite in the same way that we colloquially use the term thing, right, to describe anything. So if you have a scene, there's a variety of things, ontologically, but also aesthetically, right? You have actors, roles, you have possible developments, you have elements, and you also, of course, have things in the sense of individual material objects as well, and you have the relations in between them. But when you wanted to say that the scene changes, what do you mean by that? I mean, you can say about an individual thing, oh, something happened to it, but what do you mean when you say the scene changes?
But I have.
But,
Can I ask something?
yeah, so those were my input thoughts.
Because I'm. It's unclear to me how Kierkegaard applies the modal categories. Is it for him also related to individuals, or is it different than Aristotle, for example, or the pre-moderns that applied these categories to substances?
No, it's actually quite the same. He used them as predicates for substances. I mean, there are some exceptions. So he would also want to be able to say that some aspect of a thing, for example, is necessary. So a thing can have a certain aspect or a certain quality that is necessary while having others that are unnecessary or just possible or actual but not necessary. But actually, especially the modal category of necessity, he reserved that specifically for substances because he said it's only really applicable to two things, to God and the individual self, and everything else cannot be predicated necessity of.
And then in the scene you presented, the difficulty to describe change would be that you would have to apply these categories to each individual thing in the picture and then somehow combine them together in order to describe change within a context. No?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. And then how?
Because if you say if you have a say like a natural event, just something happening, and then you have a cause and you have an effect, then you would say there's some sort of kinetic energy that is being realized, right? Potential energy that comes into being or being realized. And you can very specifically narrow that down. So you can have a certain amount of input energy and look at the output or at the effect, and you can just draw a straight line from the input to the output. But when you have a scene, at least that's what I think, it's much more complex than that, because the scene is already made up of so many interrelations of the things that are involved, meaning that can also mean that there are some things that are, in an Aristotelian sense, moving by themselves, right? The actors, and you have things that are just objects in the material sense, and they already have those relations. But then, if you add time to that equation, so if you think about the scene changing from point A to point B, the way it could change is not some straight line, because if you just realize the potential of one specific thing in the scene to have a certain effect upon the next instantiation of the scene, there may be other parts of the same scene that vary in the input that you looked at when you were trying to describe the change. Because if you really uphold that, for example, the actors are things that are self-moving, then the decision that they make may also impact the narrow line that you have on the level of the straight material objects that are just therefore being used or being affected in some way.
I'm just gonna jump right in and take a swing at your question, because I was talking to Zach about this last week, about something similar, about how relationism is warranted by certain issues that essentialist thinking or substantialist thinking brings to the table, like you were saying. So, and this picture seems like the perfect example that when you have a set of complicated or a complicated set of things in which all of them interact and all of them are intertwined with the actions of the others and the properties of the others and so on and so forth, essentialism gets to some contradictory logics in the sense that if you want to uphold essentialism in this sense that you want to identify some properties that are essential and some other properties that are only possible or accidental, then you need to explain change based on the essential and necessary parts, and starting from that, centralize everything that's happening, each property relation, each accident that, or each event that might seem accidental, to reduce them to those core necessary qualities. And that is a daunting task if you deal with large, complex phenomena, I feel. And there's always going to be something that's not accounted for. Because if you reduce everything to physical interactions, then you leave out the emotional aspect of it. If you focus on the emotional interaction, then you leave out, I don't know, the economical aspect of it, and so on and so forth. So then what can we do? Well, our approach is to distance ourselves from essentialism, and especially from hierarchical dichotomies like necessary, accidental, or possible, actual, and to take relations at face value, let's say. They're all equally important and they're all equally real, but the way we relate to them and the way relations are dependent on certain situations can be described, let's say, locally. You can say that when we approach this scene from, I don't know, from an aesthetic point of view, what is important is the perspective, the lighting, the composition, and so on and so forth, and not so much the actual physical possibilities of agents involved. But the main point there is that each one of this narrative shows some relations from the scene you presented, but at the same time, it's still open to other descriptions from other points of view. And in order to map this, I would say possibility and actuality are necessary, but I think any necessary quality should be understood as temporarily necessary, or instead of necessary, relevant for the narrative that applies to the situation.
Yeah, but see, then you have an entirely different criterion for describing the scene when you use it, when you look at it from an aesthetic viewpoint. Because as you said, then maybe the development or the behavior of a certain character is more relevant, right? But relevancy is not probably not a characteristic that you would use or that first came to your mind when you were to describe a naturally occurring event. Because a scene, if you think of the scene from an aesthetic viewpoint, or look at it from an aesthetic viewpoint, there's a certain amount of possibilities involved, right, in how it can develop. And you can categorize these possibilities that are modally equivalent, like they are all equally possible. You can still categorize them by using the notion of relevancy. But the notion of relevancy, of course, is not something that is inherent in the modal description of the scene, but is instead put in it from the aesthetic viewpoint that you are looking at it from.
Yeah, I understand. I think I need to clarify a bit how I mean relevance. And so in our framework, or what we're trying to develop as a framework, relevance is not a criterion superimposed on a certain situation, but it describes more the way things resonate with each other. So let's say, let's take a situation, I don't know, coffee, drinking coffee, right? What is relevant there is that coffee can be diluted in water, or it can be its flavor, and caffeine can be diluted in water and can be consumed. And also relevant is the fact that two people can communicate and can interact and can share, I don't know, social situations. And that relevance is determined by the situation in which all of these things find themselves in. And by situation, I mean kind of like you were describing a scene, which is a relational framework in which you have multiple things, multiple agents, multiple interactions. And the complexity of the situation also fixes certain possibilities or certain relevancies that arise in that situation and may not arise in another situation.
But wouldn't you be equally right in saying that it's the other way around? So you could say all the reasons that you just mentioned, for your example in the scene of drinking coffee, all of those could also be viewed as the reasons why all of this came to be in the first place. So like it's a convention in a certain country to have a drink in the working break, and it's mainly coffee from the automat downstairs, and you have all those physical possibilities that make it possible for coffee to being diluted in hot water, and this all of this taken together makes the occurrence come about of there being coffee. Of coffee being drunken.
That's exactly how I see it. So that's what I wanted to say.
Okay. So yeah, then I got it
right. You mentioned that for modal categories, each one of the possibilities described by the modality of possibility is equally possible, right? But does that apply for reality as well?
Well, no. Kierkegaard has a very interesting definition, actually, of reality. So when he asks what reality means, of course, with regard to the other modal categories, he says that it's the exclusion of all possibility, and not just the possibilities that weren't realized, but also of the possibility that was realized. So once you say that a certain possibility has become real, he would say it no longer makes sense to predicate possibility from it. And that's anti-Aristotelian, right? When you think of Aristotle, you have those circles, and you can draw the biggest circle, which is all of the possible states, and then you have a narrowed down set of actual states, and then you have an even smaller set of necessary states. And Kierkegaard would say, no, it doesn't make sense to say of something that is real that it is possible. That would even be some kind of contradiction, because saying that it's actually real means that it's not anymore possible, right? It's not possible anymore. And all the other things that could be in that same place, for example, are not possible anymore either, because the thing itself is the exclusion of all other possibilities. And of course, there's still the possibility of the thing, for example, being destroyed or becoming something else or being interacted with in some way. So this possibility is not ruled out, but the possibility of the thing itself is ruled out, because the thing in itself has become real.
Well, I guess he's kind of forced to understand it like that if he describes possibility as the transition from non-being to being.
Well, no, that's not a possibility. That's a movement. That's his definition of movement. Okay. But you're right. In the definition of movement, possibility is described as a state of non-being, and actuality is a state of being, and the transition is movement.
So the problem first is the terminology. It's very complex in Aristotle. Yes. Because you have a difference between power, possibility, yes, potentiality, at least these three that, yes, you have to really understand. And also you have a different idea when you say activity, actuality, realization, and this, so the substance and reality, which are somehow related. So it's really complex to understand Aristotle just in terms of possible and necessity, for example, or possible and real. Because, for example, the point is, he's discussing with some very crazy guys, and these guys said that so the idea of these guys is in two words, like the only way of something being capable or having a potentiality is being actual. So he criticizes them.
Yes. So he would say something has to be real in order to have the capacity of something, or the potentiality of something.
That is the point. He would say, no, it doesn't need to be real in the sense of realized, but it can be at the same time a power which can be or cannot be realized. And even when realized, it doesn't lose its powerfulness. So that's the point. When you talk about reality, you don't need to completely say possibilities completely away in Aristotle, because you can say, okay, let's say we have something realized in this sense, like, and a very simple example, like I realized my knowledge of Greek by way of speaking.
Yeah.
So I'm actually speaking. So the point of Aristotle is to say, well, but by realizing it, you conserve, so to speak, the powerfulness of the power. It's still there as in potentiality, but a realized power. So the power can be in potentiality and in actuality. Yeah? Or I'm being too...
Well, I can't make sense of the notion of the power being in potentiality.
That's the interesting thing, that everything, even a situation, even a state of affairs, even a substance itself, can have an aspect in potentiality, and the other aspect would be in actuality. So you don't have to choose between reality and possibility, because reality and possibility are not the only concepts which include a sense of non-being actualized. So that's what I mean. It's not just the possibility, but also the potentiality.
Yes, I think that's also a possible way of criticizing Kierkegaard's notion, because if you say that well, I'm not going to use strictly the Aristotelian terms because I'm not able to, but if you say that something is real or actual, right, you would still want to be able to say that it's possibly not real in the future, meaning that it can undergo change. It can be destroyed, or it can become something else, or there can be a natural influence being used to make it change itself, anything of the sort. So you have the actual distinction that Kierkegaard makes is between quality of something and its existence. So you have a thing, and it's a fact that it exists, and it has certain qualities. And when you want to describe the change that a thing undergoes, you can either talk about the qualities changing, meaning that it stays basically the same thing, but it's changing its qualities, or you can say that its existence changes in the sense of this thing as this thing is not existing anymore. It has become something completely different. And you could maybe express it in Aristotelian terms if you would say that the qualities that Kierkegaard is talking about are accidental features, while what he means when he's talking about existence is like a compound of substantial qualities, or the substance itself. But I'm not sure about that. But what I was going to say is, when you want to say that a thing that is actually real is, per definition, the exclusion of all possible states, meaning of all other possibilities that could have become real in its place instead, and as well of the possibility of the thing that has become real, you would still want to be able to say that it's at least got the possibility or the potentiality, maybe in Aristotelian terms, to change or go away again, to vanish. You wouldn't say that everything that has become real is like eternally staying the same. It's still, as being real, something that participates in like a causal interrelation. And I think you could criticize Kierkegaard for that, because he seems to be obliged to exclude this possibility from a thing as well, but that would in the end force him to make the quite absurd assumption that a thing, once it has become fully realized, cannot change anymore. Then of course you could discuss about what fully realized means, and if in some sense it could still be a valid assumption. But it's always struck me that even when you wanted to say that reality means the exclusion of possibility, and you then go on to ask, well, exclusion of what possibilities exactly? What is the range of possibility that you are excluding for a thing to be this thing in its actual reality? You can give various answers. You can answer the question with various degrees of strictness. So you can say that we are just talking about a subset of relevant possibilities that are concerning this actual thing, but not more general possibilities or a context of possibilities that it is embedded in. But you could also say it cannot at least exclude the possibility of it not being there anymore or changing.
I get a little bit confused as to like, where does determinism fit in all this? If things are determined, then
no, he would say
is there so there must be a source of indeterminacy in both Aristotle and Kierkegaard.
Yes, at least in Kierkegaard it is explicitly there. Yeah. So what he says is that even in just simple natural events, if you take a naturally occurring event, what he says is that it looks as though everything is determined within that specific process. So you can describe the causal relation by using the expressions of kinetic energy and of the effect that it brings about when it is being realized. And you have all the relevant determinations in place. But he says explicitly that this is just some sort of illusion. Because if you, like in a child's play, if you were to ask of each specific determination, where does it come from and where does it end? When you just follow back the timeline or follow back the causal relations that it is in itself embedded in, then you would at the end come out at the result that you have to assume some spontaneous input, some sort of decision making or some voluntary decision, which of course in the end always means the necessity of an absolute being who brings everything about. Like it's a cosmological argument for the existence of God, actually. But he says that, sorry?
There needs to be undetermined agents that are doing
yes.
stuff.
So what he says, the expression that he uses, he doesn't say that it's a cosmological proof of God. That was my phrasing. But he uses the expression of hypothetic necessity in natural events, meaning that, of course, it looks as though all the relevant determinations were there. They are, in fact, and they cannot be changed. In fact, they are interacting in a necessary way. But this necessity can be acted upon through a free-willed being who can exercise a potential that wouldn't be in this causal relation if the free-willed being weren't there. So you can describe the natural relation in itself and be completely fine with that, but it's just a hypothetic necessity that you can attribute to.
So that could also be indeterminacy of some other source.
Yes.
Like some sort of some sort of undetermined randomness generator.
Well, that's probably not something that he had on mind, because as I said, I think the whole motivation for his argument was a bit different. So it's embedded in that theological context. But I think you could draw that consequence from the theory, yes, if you were to see what comes out of it, if you look a little bit closer. Yeah.
But I wanted to ask, concerning this issue that possibility is the exclusion, reality is the exclusion of possibility. It depends on how you take that statement, right? Because you can apply it, for example, to the scene you showed and say that in that scene, in that situation, everything that was possible about that situation and is possible is excluded from that scene because it's not there. What is there temporarily, contextually, like situationally, locally, is something that is not possible because it's actual, it's present.
But and I think that makes sense, right?
Yeah, but that
in a way it makes sense.
Yeah, that doesn't exclude the fact that in I don't know 10 minutes the situation can change, and then the possibilities excluded can become present and then also real or actual.
Yes.
No? And I think, because at first I thought this would be like incompatible to the way we approach things in a relational kind of way, that posits things as, let's call them, infinite wells of relationality, in which all of their qualities and states are determined by the relations they have with all other things, which are all equally real and equally infinite in their depth. But it actually, I think it's compatible, because what Kierkegaard is describing is a possibility and reality concept that are situationally or contextually located. And that is plausible to say that in this context, what is present is something that excludes what is not present. That's actually the part.
But that's exactly the difficulty I have, or the reason why I said you could criticize Kierkegaard's understanding. Because if you speak about things like in a way that set theory does, so you have like a fixed universe of things and you can rearrange them, then you can of course define a certain set of things by saying that it excludes the things that are not part of this set that we're looking at now. But if you take a scene, which by its nature is taking place in a spatio-temporal universe where you have time, change, and movement, the problem is that if you define a certain scene as the exclusion of everything that is not real at this moment, or not present, as you said, you have to give an account for, or an explanation for, the fact that in the next scene, something else can be there. So you have to explain the possibility of this scene being changed. So you have to describe the scene already in a way that you implement its potentiality of being changed into it. But of course, if you just look superficially at the scene, you just see what's real, or as you said, what's present. Mm-hmm. And the difficulty is to describe what is present also by terms of potentiality and power and all those Aristotelian notions that Fede mentioned, as some aspect or quality of a thing that is involved in a scene, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to account for the change taking place. If what is present really were everything that is present, then it weren't able to change at all. Right?
I think this is the moment where I can become annoying and talk about Badiou and pretend I understand set theory. But I think there's a really cool argument in Badiou about change and how change can occur in set theory without presupposing something else than set theory. And he makes the distinction between the relation of belonging to a set and the relation of being included into a set. And belonging means to be included in a set and be recognized by the set as as part of itself, as according to its own axioms. Included is just being present but not recognized by that set as its own part. And to make this clearer, applied to the scene you presented, what you would call possibilities can be regarded as included in the set but not belonging.
But not belonging.
Yes.
Yes.
And then change occurs for Badiou when the parts that are included in the set become belonging parts of the set. But that, and this is an essential point, that only happens if the axioms of the set also change in order to include what was not belonging to it. So it's not just a quantitative expansion of a set, it's a qualitative change that occurs. And this is how he understands political change, for example.
But if by making an element belong to the set and not just being included in it anymore, by changing the axioms as well, wouldn't that mean that you would also change the things that were already belonging to the set?
No. So the changing of the axioms, according to set theory principles, includes, or so when you have a new extended set with an extended axiom syntax, that also includes the old members of the set and the old axiom. So you can't expand the set with contradictory axioms.
I get that, but so then you have a very linear understanding of like, if you try to imagine it, you have like a circle that's growing. If you think about the set, because the real change that is occurring is, of course, you change the axioms as well, but mainly what occurs is an expansion of the set, right?
So I think Badiou would see it as non-linear, because for him, this expansion of the set is not something that is done uniformly and continuously. It's something that he calls eventful. So it happens precisely because these elements that were included in the set but not belonging to the set cause a certain tension in the structure of the set, which then determines the set kind of in like a speculative kind of way or dialectical kind of way to go not just to not grow just in size, but also to grow in level, to confront themselves with elements that negate their axioms, and then from negation go to a point further, kind of like. So I guess there is the danger of seeing it as expanding in a linear way, but I think you can also find arguments against that change cannot be linear. Change, like actual change, not just a new element in a set, but change that somehow changes the scene that you were presenting, so something new happens there. I think that has to have an equilibrium between including the old axioms and having a new reframing of those axioms. Otherwise, you would have a complete break and no continuity in experience.
Yes. So I was asking that about linear expansion just because of the scene, right? Because when you look at the scene, you would want to say that that's an understanding that isn't complex enough to describe the change of a scene.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I think it's really it's amazing how many difficulties arise when you try to answer the question of what it means that a scene changes, because I think it has something to do also with. I mean, it's getting a bit like I'm probably getting distracted a bit too much, but it may also have to do something with those paradoxes, Because if you think of a scene, you can also think, of course, of a picture, because what I sent you is actually a picture, right? It's not actually a scene being played or anything, but it's a picture of a scene. And of course, if you think about a scene that is changing, meaning that another scene is now taking place, you could make another picture of that new scene. And then you could show the change that has occurred, right, by comparing the pictures. But of course, if you think about a movie is nothing but a fast succession of momentary still pictures. Also, those scenes, you could put a potentially infinite amount of other pictures of the scene in between those two that you were comparing in the first place to recognize a change. And this, of course, already occurs on a very basic level when you're talking about natural processes, but it's kind of elevated when you talk about a scene, because as you mentioned, there's not only things involved, but also, of course, relations and actors and all the things that I also mentioned at the beginning. And the thing is that when you try to describe it on the same level as like a linear expansion, or as we talked about before, as a natural event, or similar to a natural event, you already come into these paradoxes. But it's getting even more interesting when you think about it, as I was trying to do at first, from what Kierkegaard calls the aesthetic viewpoint. I'm not sure of how much you talked already about aesthetics in TTT. Probably not too much. Mm-hmm. But Kierkegaard has this notion of aesthetics that it's not really only about beautiful things or artworks or anything like that, but it's more like an existential notion. So when he uses the term aesthetic, he also means a certain way of life, or a mode of existence, or a sphere even of existence, as he says. And what he means by that is that the aesthetic-minded person views the world in possibilities, meaning that it consists of a vast array of possibilities that can be realized, and because of that, it becomes very interesting to just try to realize some of those possibilities and others not, and just dive into what's possible, right? You can choose what you want to do with your life, and you can make decisions or revise your decisions, and you can take a certain joy in just doing stuff and realizing your potential. And you do that by letting yourself be guided by what he calls the principle of what's interesting, right? The notion of something being interesting is central for the aesthetic point of view. And that also, of course, has something to do with the general sense of the word, or the common sense of the word aesthetics, meaning that it's something that speaks to us, to our natural interest for something that's maybe beautiful or sublime.
It seems a little contradictory, though, doesn't it? In that the aesthetic seems to be about the experience of something, right? Like, if the aesthetic person is often considered to be approaching the world as a menu of experiences.
Yes.
Like, so they're enjoying the various sensations that they have.
Yes.
Those sensations must be things that are realized. And therefore, like, the aesthetic person is sort of going around ending possibility.
Yes, that's. But I think that what you're pointing at is probably exactly what Kierkegaard would criticize when he analyzes this point of view, because he would say, yes, that's exactly the point. If you try to get fulfillment by realizing certain possibilities, they are no longer of any interest for you once they have become real, or once you have followed through with realizing them. And that's indeed his critique of the principle of being interested in something. He says that it's an ethical misunderstanding to think that value in life is generated by realizing potential or possibilities, because you've already, once you go about realizing something, you've made a decision for that, and it potentially becomes your ethical duty to go through with it in another way than just having fun realizing them and then just going away and doing something else. So what he of course has in mind is all kinds of like erotic endeavors. Think about erotic endeavors, for example. So what he's trying to say is that it takes a sort of commitment and decision making to really stick with the choice that you've made, and to realize it in a full meaning of the word, or the full sense of the word. And he would say that the aesthetic interest in the possibility of an erotic endeavor is an ethical misunderstanding, and is really actually mistreating the person that you're using to fulfilling this desire or trying to realize this possibility. So there's of course an inherent paradox in the aesthetic viewpoint that he criticizes, but from another standpoint, from the ethical standpoint.
So he was criticizing objectifying and consumerism.
Yes. And he did it sometimes in a little bit conservative way. I can't remember the word in English. Reactionary maybe is possibly a word in English as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I think the aesthetic example is a really good one to explain what I was meaning with having a new set of axioms that includes the old one. Because think of aesthetical movements, for example. Think of the evolution of art and having aesthetical revolutions with abstract art, with cubism, with Dadaism, and so on and so forth. None of them are isolated. They draw their power precisely because they rewrite some old axioms of aesthetics. But by that process, the old axioms are present in each cubist painting, for example. It is a deconstruction of conservative ways of depicting something. And by that process, the conservative process of depicting something is also included there and present. So I don't think change contradicts that thought. But I was also, I think it's easy to talk of change in this sense in like cultural events or art events or I don't know, things that have to do with humans, because there's a memory there, there's a history involved that binds the old and the new. But I was curious how this would be seen from a more scientific point of view, from I don't know, neuronal structures. How is new processed there, like novelty or?
Well, the evolution could be an example, maybe, where you have millions of years of a sort of DNA chain, and then after these millions of years, something happens and humans came to be. So it's a huge and amazing change that I still don't understand how it happened. I mean, so I think that would be a scientific example of these kind of big changes, even like of the rules of being.
It's also not clear that fairly different histories or genetic structure couldn't also produce humans, right? Like you can have multiple similar phenotypes from different genotypes, which sort of makes sense if you think about like skin pigmentation within humans, in that the genetic basis for that at different parts of the planet is very different, but the outcome is or somewhat different, but the outcome is the same. So it sort of goes in the opposite direction as well, and that you could have large changes in the structure that don't change the humanness of the individual, right? So we could have very different genetic order and different distribution of alleles and things like this, but still have a pretty similar individual at the end of it.
And what will be an axiom in the case of evolution? Because as I understand evolution, it has like axiom sounds like a kind of rule that is managing how evolution happens, and it's not like that, right? It's more like many processes that are happening together and happen to at the end to flow together into a new species. But it's not like there is a rule saying, okay, now we change the way these species are.
I guess the axioms would be that like
There's rules.
there needs to be heritability, variability. So there needs to be variation in traits and how they contribute to fitness, and they need to be heritable.
But it's not something that change altogether. Like,
wait, let
when
me
you were
clarify
talking
what I mean
about
by axioms and
sorry, yeah.
what I mean by changing axioms. So I don't when you talk in set theory about a set expanding to make other elements part of itself by changing the axioms of that set, that doesn't refer to the axioms of set theory. It refers to the localized relations of belonging, changing the way they structure things in a subset. So they refer to a structural change within a subset, a localized system, but they don't refer to a structural change throughout the whole structure of set theory. So in the case of evolution, what changes is the localized system that experiences a new kind of mutation, let's say. So that would be the structural change there. It doesn't change the entire evolutionary tree. It doesn't change the way they all cohere together. So it's change is localized, but at the same time it can be structural but also localized.
Okay.
I guess metallization would be the genetic equivalent of something like that. Like we can have two exactly the same monozygotic twins, but you could in some way induce metallization of the genes, which means they're transcribed differently, or their position on the histone. So it would also essentially be the same rules are playing out on both, but variability within their internal nature leads to a different output, I think. Right?
Yeah, I think it gets a bit weird to talk about axioms in biology in general, because I guess the idea, at least for me, axiom sounds more like something in mathematics, something that can be like, or in logic, no? Some are things that are not dependent on other things to be proved. And I think with this level of description, like if we are talking about evolution, then it doesn't really make sense to think about axioms. But there are some, like there are theories or laws that define these processes that don't need to change locally to allow change. They remain the same.
No, axioms was just like an analogy to make sense of change. It doesn't have to apply throughout different frameworks.
One thing that just came to my mind is I don't know if you guys heard about post-Darwinism, this theory of people that look at evolution and humanity as something that defies the axioms that Darwin postulated as being the axioms for evolution, like what Scott was saying, like heritability, etc. By saying that, for example, we as humans have kind of found ways to propagate your genes even without quote unquote natural heritability, because we can, for example, erase genetic malfunctions, or we can cure diseases that would be otherwise be naturally occurring. So that I think is more a drastic change, because it's like technologically imposed. But the rebuttal to these people is that you can still slot that perfectly into a Darwinist narrative by just saying that that is indeed a version of fitness. It's just that I am anthropomorphizing it and making it distinct, but nowhere in the system or in the theory is it described as it having to be something natural, quote unquote. And that leads me to something that I wanted to say in the beginning, and that's I think when I raised my hand, Razvan, in comment to something that Jonas said about naturally occurring processes. That really struck me as an interesting comment because I had never thought about the possibility of something other than naturally occurring process. So I would love to just understand what you meant by what's the possibility other than a natural occurring process.
So that's a difference that Kierkegaard makes, and I was just using that. But I think it's not too difficult to grasp, actually. The difference that he makes is, well, a natural event is really just like a physical event, meaning something happening meteorologically, a weather event, for example. And he would say that you can describe such an event by making use of the notions like kinetic energy and a certain potential being realized. And when you know all the determinations, so if you have all information about a certain situation, then you can make a prediction, a precise prediction of what will happen. And he says that as soon as actors are involved, so he supposed that individuals do have a free will with which to make decisions, then the potential that they realize is not already embedded in the situation, but is only ever there if they are there making use of this and realizing the potential. And of course, you have to accept his notion of a free-willed individual realizing potential in order for this distinction to make sense. You could also just say, well, there are only naturally occurring events, and even if an actor is involved, it may seem from an internal perspective that it is a free will that is realizing a potential that is only there for it to be realized. But this is an illusion, and actually it's just also simply a naturally occurring event. So I wasn't like defending Kierkegaard's position, but that's what he.
Yeah. I was just being provocative.
Yes.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
This is interesting. This kind of gets to something I struggle with determinism, which is that for a system to be fully deterministic, part of it means that you don't generate new stuff. That all the stuff we have now is just fundamentally just reorganizations of existing stuff, right? There was stuff that began at the beginning that had, in the terms of TTT, an infinite pool of possible relations, and that's it. We just restructure that, and from each subsequent moment, there's in principle no space for what we normally conceive of as free will, because there's no novelty.
Yes.
Right? There's just restructuring stuff along principles.
And Kierkegaard would say, well, that's actually that's a coherent view if you suppose that free will doesn't involve a potential being realized that wouldn't be there if it weren't for the free will. So he would say, okay, if the naturalists are right in that everything that there is are naturally occurring events, and that we have this pool of infinite possibilities in the beginning, that the only thing that ever happens is a rearranging process, and we can describe this process by making use of the notion of the natural laws, and we can predict the outcome of certain forms of rearrangements without having to make use of the notion of a potential that wasn't there in the beginning. But he would say, well, if we are to think of a free will being able to realize a potential, that also involves thinking about it in a way that means the potential that a free will realizes wouldn't have been there. It exactly wouldn't have been there before, because if it weren't for free will, it would have been a natural event, and that means it could have been described by making use just of the notion of natural laws and kinetic energy and all of that stuff.
This is it implies that, like, if you imagine time as a series of slices, that in between each slice of of time where natural laws apply. You sort of have to squeeze something in there, which has a bit of will in it, right?
Yes, although you know, I mean, you may point to an inconsistency there, but in my reconstruction or in my understanding of what Kierkegaard is saying, I think he is committed to an atomistic view of time. I think he would say that it only makes sense for us to think of time if we think of it as being made up of distinct parts that are finite and not infinitely divisible.
Well, I guess what I meant was like there would be like, for will to occur, you have to have something in between each moment as defined by natural law, right?
Yes. Or you could also say you wouldn't really have to say between, but you could say it's like a supervenience relation. So, you know, at the bottom you always have the natural processes, and of course the enactment of the will or the realization of the decision that the will has made also means doing something on the level of the natural relations. But on top of that, there's what he would call the deliberation or decision making, which is not in the same sense part as a causal element within that line of events on the natural plane. Oh, yeah, so it's like a superimposed or supervening structure.
Yeah. I guess this gets to sort of things like emergence and submergence. So like the idea of beings that are more than the sum of their parts, and submergence being, and that those things can have unpredictable effects on those larger objects, but also submergence in that emergent properties can then have sort of downward cause on their constituent parts.
Exactly.
As well, like you need to have upward and downward causation.
Yes, and I think that may also have something to do with him thinking of even the natural processes as having their beginning in some sort of spontaneous happening or event, or of course choice, if you want to put it more theologically. So he thought of the row of natural events as pointing backwards in time to a point where there was the decision to be made if the timeline starts or it doesn't. And that means for him that the entire row of natural events also has its initial moment in a spontaneous decision or in a potential realized that is not simply part of the set of infinite possibilities that the universe is made up of that you talked before, but that only ever itself came into being or to being realized by another form of being having made the decision to realize it. And what we are doing when we are like executing our free will or making use of our free will is some sort of resembling the initial decision of creating the world. So we are like doing a miniature imitation of the same process. You could say that, of course, that's not what Kierkegaard literally says, but that's what you could draw out of it, I think.
Seems like you can sort of resolve that without need for typical agent by having multiple worlds. So
yes.
Like, if you have many worlds, the world that you happen to be in is the world that's defined by your choice.
Yes.
Like if I have a choice to like choose left or choose right in a many worlds hypothesis, both left and right outcomes exist, and if I'm in right, it's because I chose right.
Yes.
And left, I chose left. So like the transcendental agency just becomes the world you happen to be in, and there you can sort of reduce it all down to natural law, but the agency is just a description of which world you happen to be in. So it's interesting.
Yeah, and I think that of course it's like we are talking on the metaphysical level now, but you could also look at it on like a lower level or a more concrete or more empirical way. That you could say, well, in some sense, it makes sense to look at it this way, because you would say that regionally speaking, even in our empirical everyday world, you would want to say that the decisions that we make also end up having an impact on the world that surrounds us as the ones who are realizing the potentials that are involved in the decision making. meaning that you also experience yourself as an individual being by realizing that your actions have effects in the world around you. So that's a really important part of your self-esteem, and you realizing in a psychological sense, being an individual whose actions have consequences. That's really like an integral part of being a person and having a functional conscience and personality structure. So I think in a more empirical way of talking, this also makes sense. You don't have to have, this metaphysical notion of an entire world depending on your choice, but you can also say that regionally speaking, experiencing the choices that you have made as having effects and as recognizing yourself in the effects that it has had as integral for you
it does
experiencing yourself as a
But speaking of that, because it came to my attention that you might perceive TTT as deterministic. Do you perceive it? Well, from this discussion, it seemed like it is implied that TTT is also deterministic. Do you perceive it as that?
I don't have a strong opinion on that, but I don't know what. Like it's hard for me to think in a way that's not deterministic. However, I'm not entirely convinced of complete determinism. Because if everything is fully deterministic, why is it happening? Isn't it done? Everything collapses down to the first point. The only problem is that we are creatures that don't yet know the math. This doesn't make any. Somehow that doesn't sit with me in a way that I can fully inculcate. A fully deterministic world just seems sort of like playing in a philosophical sandbox. It has not necessarily bumped up against the noisy and uncomfortable aspects of reality. So I don't find the idea that we are fully determined to be compelling. Also, the other part of this is that, like, in the context of will, one argument is that if I have to go back to, like, my argument can go back to the first electrons or photons that are bumped into each other to say that I'm not in charge of whether I have my next cup of tea. That just seems like a very baroque and unreasonable explanation.
But I think clarification is also due that non-deterministic systems are also not dependent on free will. They can also be built on contingency, let's say.
Yeah. But when you say TTT is not deterministic, in what way is it not?
Well, the way I see it is, and I think this is an important clarification that has to be made, it's not that TTT talks of one infinite set of relations, which is the world, but it talks about all things as their own infinite relational sets. And if you have a plurality of infinite relational sets, their configurations, let's say, they are non-deterministic because the interactions that occur are can be highly volatile, let's say, and subjected to unexpected change. It also includes the possibility of agency for sets that include the property or the relation of agency. And yeah, I guess I see it more from a contingency point of view, not so much based on free will, because for me that would be a return to, well, essentialism or transcendental ethical views, which imply a hierarchy and a distinction between nature and humans, or nature and culture. And TTT wants to get rid of that, of that dichotomy-based philosophy. And then that also means you have to reframe freedom and the degrees of freedom and how actions are possible and how change is possible without including a causal chain that determines everything.
But without including a causal chain.
Yeah.
Like, okay. But this started when we began talking about novelty, right?
Yeah.
So this movement into biology, when Petty mentioned genetics as an example of novelty and how biological systems represent that. Like in TTT, there's every object has an infinite well of relations. So there's, in principle, when two things interact, there's clearly constraints upon the types of relations those two things can enter into. right? Like one has eyes and the other thing's colored or whatever, you know. But so, maybe I'm not sure how to say this exactly. There is clear constraints on the types of interactions that these things have, but they're not sufficiently constrained to be determined. So even if it's just two electrons, they each both have an infinite set of relations. And when those two electrons approach each other, like, are those relations determined by what will happen if they're within certain proximity or not? We know that, like, if we behave with two electrons in fairly reproducible ways, they will behave in fairly reproducible ways, and their interactions and relationships will be fairly reproducible, I think.
That's true. But so I think there is once again the need to make the distinction between localized determinism and global determinism. And what TTT is against global determinism. Situational or localized determinism is possible because in a closed system you can determine, or you can reduce everything to one, I don't know, formula of probabilistic event taking. But what TTT is against the global kind of determinism, which, like Jonas was saying, which tries to take the series of events that constitutes the world and reduce them to one ontological element, which would be, in certain cases, an underlying substance, in other cases, one creator that instills life into everything, or a free agent that shapes the world at its own will. So this is the ontological determinism, let's say, and then there's the localized determinism that has to happen in certain approaches to, I don't know, describing physical systems. It doesn't have to happen, but it is useful, I mean. And in that sense, I wouldn't say it's not possible to describe how one thing causes or how one thing determines another thing in a closed system, controlled and considered in abstraction from its other infinity of relational
So in this sense, like, you're talking about, like, there's this distinction between hard and soft emergence, right? So if you're a soft emergentist, you think that the reason we can't predict emergent properties from neural activity or whatever else is because we're just not computationally sophisticated enough to do so, right? Like, there's too many possibilities and there's too many moving parts. So the emergence we see, the novelty we encounter is novel, but not unpredictable. We just don't know how to do that yet because we're a young species. Yeah, hard emergentists, they sort of think that, right, something new has occurred that could not have been predicted. It seems like, well, I'm not sure those things are necessarily contradictory, oddly, and I think TTT actually might make that clear. So if you have an infinite possible number of relations in a very localized sense, you know what are the constraining things on the types of relations two objects can enter into, and therefore you can be deterministic. But once you get to a wide enough scale, you would need more computational power than the things that are there, right? Like, you would need more stuff than is existing in that space to predict it, right? Because once you have a certain number of relations, it should become computationally intractable using all of the substance within that area. Does that make sense? Like, if you, like, imagine you had a planet, you're trying to figure out using the planet, so we build silicon stuff from the parts of the planet to make computers. If we use all the stuff on the planet to try and predict the planet, we would probably fail.
I think
this energy and computation required to track
like
all
the observer paradox, in physics. That's what you're saying. So
something like that. I think is Hofstadter about this. It's like the Hofstadter's, like, it's a sort of self-referential problem, right? Like, to understand the thing in itself, if it's sufficiently complicated enough, because the computational power required to predict it doesn't scale linearly, would require more energy and stuff than the thing you're trying to predict, I think. Right? Like,
I guess if I may comment on something that Razvan said about the the local determinism. For me, and I'm still trying to clarify if my view is totally compatible with TTT or not. It's that it's always about the degree of confidence with which I can predict a certain event to occur and the distribution of probability of events occurring given some scenario. And in very simple scenarios like electrons, for example, I can determine with a very high probability, and therefore I say it's deterministic. But I would say that even though TTT would probably agree with this, it would also say that it is possible, quote unquote possible, for other things to happen. Right? It's just that it's very, very, very unlikely because we understand that system very well.
I think
On a macro level, we don't understand the system, so therefore it's very hard to predict. So I don't know if it's compatible with what you were saying, Razvan, but that's the way I see it.
It is. But I think there's another aspect to it, which is it's not just about including more things into the description that is localized, that is locally deterministic, and then somehow imploding that because of lack of computational power. It's also the fact that each description that applies a deterministic pattern can apply that pattern related to one set of relevancies, to one set of descriptions, like I don't know, charge relations in particles, or gravity, or I don't know what else.
How edible?
Yeah, but that wouldn't apply to all of the other descriptions possible about things. So you can apply a deterministic narrative about a large set of objects, but that determinism will always be localized because it cannot account for all of the other narratives that can be involved. Like, I don't know, so you can have a deterministic law of gravity, but that law of gravity applies to human beings on the planet that it describes. But those human beings have internal lives, they have family relations, they have economical relations, they have so on and so forth. And
like if we go back to Jonas's picture on that, which I think is a good example of it.
Yes.
Is that we can look at this picture and we can say, oh, we know things about this, right? That guy's going to put something in that bag. That person's looking out a window. If we think this is a normal, let's say this could be in this is cafes in New York in 3 different situations. One is just a random Tuesday and they're all sitting around. One is like the day of September 11th, and the other one is the day that Donald Trump just got defeated, right? And then like, although all those actions are locally determined, and that it's not going to make the liquid jump out of a cup into someone's mouth because these events have occurred, but what they're looking out the window at is entirely different, right? Like what their next action is likely to be is also determined, but whether they're standing up to run out of the room or jump up and cheer, or what a shout means, or what any increase in their volume of speaking means in that context is very different across the 2 situations, right?
Yeah.
Like if one of them runs out of the room screaming, they could be like a really powerful Biden or Trump supporter, or they could be a crazy person if it's a normal Tuesday, or they could be like concerned for the situation if it's the day of September 11th, right? Like that global situation surrounds that and disrupts all the determinism in there, I guess.
I like how you can spontaneously develop infinite chains of situations and describe them in detail. It's impressive.
Thank you.
But yeah, I would agree with your description, and I think that is the main line of argument against determinism. But we haven't really thought so much about it in terms of determinism.
Yeah, I still don't know how it exactly relates to to the computational power example. Like if this was the holodeck on the Enterprise, I could probably create those three circumstances pretty easily, right? Well, not easily, but given that they do it in Star Trek, it's impossible in the Star Trek world. But like like you would insert some function into each person that would determine their behavior, right? Like they are all sane, therefore a person will not run out screaming on Tuesday, but they might run out screaming on Trump Day or 9/11 Day.
Yeah, but would you also create the internal life of each character and the histories that impacted those internal lives and the actions that each person has produced and the effects that each person has instilled into the world and so on and so forth?
It's a good point. Actually, there is an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation that deals with exactly this problem when Captain Riker is kidnapped by Romulans and they try to extract information from him by creating a simulation of the Enterprise. And when he asks personal questions or things about people's history, it takes more computational time, and therefore they pause and are unable to provide the answers, eventually revealing the fact that he's inside a false environment, curiously. But that does imply that in that situation, if you had a big enough computer, you could do it.
Which is actually the way I think about it, Scott.
So I think the question is like, can you have a big enough computer? At what point does it become intractable?
Okay, but then we get into paradoxes, because then the computer will also have to include itself at each point of the calculation.
Yeah, that's the sort of the thing that I'm also hinting at.
That's why I was saying it's a paradox in computation.
But I have a question to what Razwan said before about determinism. Because when Scott and I discussed what Kierkegaard thought about determinism before, I presented his theory as something like the free will realizing a potential that wasn't involved in the determinate series of causal events. But I also said that Kierkegaard makes the presupposition that at the beginning, of the spatio-temporal line of events, you have a free choice of a creator to insert something into this series and let it start and go on from there. And Razwan said before that there's something like regional necessity or determinism, or determinism on some level, but not on another. And I always wondered, that's a question that I wasn't really able to answer for myself. I always wondered if it's possible for us to think of such a thing as limited or regional determinism, because you have the natural intuition that if you ascribe determinacy to a series of events, then you would have to hold your ascription top down or bottom up, whichever way you want to look at it. You would say that as well as on the lowest possible level of description, meaning the one that Kierkegaard would describe as the level of making use of the notions of natural laws and kinetic energy and that stuff, as well as on the highest level that he's talking about, namely our conscious conceptions about the world. All of those levels, determinism would hold. Or you could show that there's like a line connecting them vertically, meaning that you cannot make sense of a statement like there is determinism, say, on the electrocharge or gravitational level, but on a higher level that emerges from the substructure, there appears to be a non-determined entity.
I think
and I think there are various ways that you could answer this question. You could say, okay, if that's the case, I say that there's no determinism at all, and I follow the Kierkegaardian way, and I say whenever something seems to be pointing to complete determinism, it's only some sort of illusion, and at the beginning there was indeed some kind of like only a hypothetically necessary decision of everything to come about. But you could also go the other way and say, okay, if that's the case, then any complex higher level structure that occurs only comes up with the illusion, or as you said, in our internal life or psychological insights, we only come up with the illusion of realizing the potential that is not there within the natural series of events. And then you could say everything is determined. But what would be the answer if you said some things are determined and some things not? Would that be some sort of emergence theory? That you would have a subset of naturally determined events and series of events that are causally related, but they produce in succession something of a higher order, an entity that is no longer confined within the limitations of such a determinism? Or what would such an answer look like if you weren't committed to the top-down, bottom-up notion of determinism?
I think this counter argument from a Kierkegaard standpoint is only sustainable if it also assumes an essentialist point of view and a hierarchical point of view, which are combined. So determinism, from a localized standpoint, only trickles down to the entire fabric of the universe and of experience if you assume there is some essential part of the universe to which everything relates to, or on which everything centers, or to which everything can get reduced to. Otherwise, if you get rid of that description, so if you say there is no essential element of the universe on which everything depends on, like in your example, in TTT, not everything is emerging from physical particles, from subatomic particles or whatever. It's not just pure combinations of atomary elements. That would imply a dichotomy of essential, substantial atomary elements that combine and then produce secondary entities. And TTT doesn't regard them as that. TTT regards each possible or each existing thing as an infinite equal relational field. And each one of these things can inhabit certain situations and can have distinct relations. They don't all share the same relations. And if you take this argument and put it in other areas or categories, let's say animate and inanimate objects, you would say that if animate, the category of animate applies to only one region of things, then it wouldn't be sustainable if it doesn't apply to all. And the same thing can be said, and this would be a paradox. But the same thing can be said of determinism. You can have determinism localized from a human perspective to a certain system in which, if it is predictable enough, you can call it determinist. But at the same time, that deterministic description doesn't exclude, like in Scott's example, it doesn't exclude all of the baggage, let's say, that a person carries with them, or a geological layer in the Earth's crust, which doesn't only include a deterministic evolution of layers upon layers, but it also includes fossils, and it gives insight into the lives of each of those fossils, and not all of them can be ordered in the same deterministic pattern. But enough about those things can be said on a superficial level that we warrant the description of deterministic in order to make them useful paradigm. So it's localized in that sense. It's not localized in the sense that it only applies in a certain region and it doesn't apply to the others. It's localized in the sense that it is applied locally within a situation when enough constraints and parameters are known. So it's a subset of human cognition that is shared by objects that are known based on those parameters, I would say. But that doesn't mean it trickles down to the ontological makeup of things as infinite relationalities.
So in the sense,
Makes sense?
I think so. Like the locality is a little clearer now, in that, like, you can imagine, like, if you think of Mecca, and you have like tons of people walking around their stone there doing their thing, they're very predictable, right? Or if you have like 100 people in a small room and someone shouts fire, they're quite predictable overall, right? Like, you can use fluid dynamics stuff to model how those people move. But if no one else is there, and I just drop one person by the stone of Mecca, I have no idea what's going to happen. Maybe they sit down, maybe they go for a dander, maybe they walk around in a circle, but it's not clear what will happen, right? And sometimes the one person seems more local, right? Because it's a smaller thing, we're looking more directly at what's going to happen, but somehow intuitively we know that the constraints that you describe, right, within the situation. So situation one is person by Mecca, situation two is lots of people by Mecca, and situation two is more predictable than situation one, and that's because of that situation being constrained via the relations within it, right? So the locality, so what is local is sort of how specific the situation is. And I guess lots of people in that situation all relating to each other make it more of a constrained situation. I'm not sure I said that right, but
yeah, but
it's also a conceptual locality, in the sense that you apply predictability there on movement or certain aspects of behavior. So you also isolate the conceptual framework on which you want to apply an ideally deterministic model.
Because I feel like the even given our open field experiment, like the experience of the individuals in the big crowd might be more predictable also. Like, I guess if you wanted to ask, I'm not sure what questions there must be a set of questions you would ask about the crowd that would be less predictable than about the individual. But it's actually hard to think what they are. I guess, like,
when you change from the crowd to the individual, you're also changing, in a way, you're changing like the amount of evidence you have to predict something, or the kind of evidence that you have. It's looking at the crowd versus looking at the individual, but you're also changing the thing you're trying to infer from what you are observing. So you're changing from, I want to know the behavior of a crowd, to I want to know, like, which is also I want to know the behavior of individuals inside a crowd, versus I want to know the behavior of an individual that is not a part of a crowd. So I guess for the crowd, you could also be asking, what will this crowd be doing as a part of a city? Like, how will they move?
But I think if you also ask about that question about one person in the crowd versus one person on their own, I think it's a good point. I think what I said stands then even more so, and perhaps it's a better comparison actually.
Yeah,
that person's move. If you ignore the crowd to try and predict them, they'll still be more deterministic.
There's one point here that I feel like I'm not getting across. It's the locality maybe is misguiding. What I'm trying to differentiate here is epistemic determinism and metaphysical determinism. Metaphysical determinism is a really strong kind of determinism that takes from one localized situation, like our finite present or history, and tries to deduce from that a principle that applies from the beginning of the world through to the end of the world, and explains every single bit of thing and relations that there are in the world. So reducing everything there is from a localized system to an ontological principle that explains everything and each action, each change, each event, everything. And
I think
that is what is being denied by TTT. And then the weaker version of epistemic determinism can be integrated in a relational ontology that accepts both high degrees of freedom and change and localized epistemic determinism. That's the main point I want to make by locality.
Yes, now I understand it way better, because the problem that I had with what Scott just said is that if you use the notion of predictability, the epistemic standpoint comes into play, because predictability is only a necessary parameter at all because we are observing a situation from an epistemologically deficient standpoint. Meaning that if we were a godlike intellect that had access to all relevant information to a situation, we would always end up at metaphysical determinism of the kind that Razvan just pointed to. So that was Leibniz's notion, right? But predictability and also probability are like second-order modal categories. I mean, on the first level, you have the predicate of something being possible, of an event that you describe. And on the second level, you predicate a certain probability of that possibility, of it becoming actuality. And in doing so, you operate with your deficient epistemological standpoint. Because if you had all relevant information, you wouldn't have to attribute a certain probability to a certain possibility, but instead could identify the only necessarily realized possibility without having to make use of the notion of probability.
Yeah, exactly. Like if we had an epistemic determinism and matched metaphysical determinism, we wouldn't be engaged in prediction. It's true. Like memory, looking forward to looking backwards would be identical, right? Like your memory, well, you would have perfect memory and perfect forevision, right?
Yes,
and
exactly.
Then the entire existence just kind of collapses down to a tiny point, because it doesn't matter in which direction it goes anymore, really, right?
Yes, and I think that that's a really it may seem like a superficial point to point that out, this difference, but I think there's another dimension to it which makes it a little bit more complicated, because if you were to attribute a probability of us ever overcoming our deficient epistemological standpoint, you wouldn't want to attribute a possibility of 1.0 to that. You would want to leave some space for the possibility that we never overcome our epistemologically deficient standpoint. And if that is the case, so if we can make the argument that we are not rightfully attributing a probability of 1.0 to our ever overcoming our deficient standpoint, then we never can get rid of the notions that come into play that seem from a metaphysical standpoint of probably obsolete. If we had a godlike intellect, we could say free will, but that's just an illusion. But since that standpoint is inaccessible to us and only via approximation, if you can say that, can we get closer to anything like it, but we will never reach it, then we will also, per definition of the nature of our getting to know things, we will never reach the point of being able to get rid of the notions that only ever entered the world because of this epistemologically deficient standpoint, namely decision making or deliberation, or deficient memory as well, that designates the input that is relevant for our deliberation. And so we cannot get rid of the illusion of freedom. So that's the Kantian argument that you could make. You can never get rid of you thinking you're free.
But to summarize that, you're saying that if we don't know for sure, if we can know for sure, then we can't be sure.
Yes, I think if you can know for sure, if you know for sure, then that's an argument for not being too sure of being able to be sure.
If we don't know now that if we don't know we can be sure, then we can't be sure that we're right. So if we don't know that we're sure, we can't be sure.
Yes. So I think that's maybe more interesting, like a second dimension to the thought of an epistemologically or epistemic deficient situation, because superficially it only looks like a temporary argument, right? You could always say it's just a hypothesis, but as soon as an idealized state of events is realized, or an ideal situation comes about, then we can get rid of the notion of probability, and determinism holds true.
Yeah.
But what if we cannot even conceive consistently of a situation in which we are ever really able to get rid of the notion of probability?
I guess in this that sort of fits nicely with both TTT and OOO, because with the withdrawal of objects or the infinite possible relations, that fits very nicely with the fact that because things are withdrawn, we now can't be sure that we will know everything about it because some part will always be withdrawn. And if there are infinite relations, we can't know that we'll know all those relations. So we don't know.
Yeah.
And won't know.
Yes.
I guess once you realize that, it must be kind of fun to have, because basically everyone who's saying we do know or don't know are just people that have varying confidences about how much they know or how likely they are to know, when in actual fact they can't know. That's kind of, that's fun.
But there aren't two dimensions in it, like an epistemological dimension and an ontological one, in the sense that on the one side, we cannot cover all probabilities because our own finite relation to it, or our finite intellection of it, or because it is in itself like impossible to measure or can realize something that is just not probable.
Yeah, I think that's the ontological here is the same as the metaphysical in that context, right?
Yes.
They're sort of identical.
No, but I think Fedi was.
We're necessarily epistemically bound. Yeah. And then after that, I'm not sure we can say anything about the rest, right? We can't know if we can't overcome that epistemic boundary. Like one could
I think Fedi was addressing like the perspective. How do you apply the perspective? Does the thing we withdraw because we can't know too much about it, or does it withdraw because it is infinitely big and it can never be fully exhausted by no relation, not just to us? And I would say TTT, like it's short, TTT goes the second way, that no thing can be exhausted by no other thing, because each interaction is situational. So each interaction is finite. It doesn't just apply to human relations. So for example, no planet exhausts every gravitational field.
So you're sort of knocking down the boundary between epistemic and ontological then by moving it outside of humans, right? Like no stuff can know no other stuff can know everything about other stuff. There is no substance that can know any other substance.
Yeah,
right? So therefore,
I think this is
there's nothing out there that could predict. There's no combination of silicon. There's no type of computer that could generate binary statements about the next time step or some time steps in the future or whatever they do.
That would be exactly what I mean with ontological. That even with the best technology, it wouldn't cover a possibility.
Because the technology is stuff, right? Like no stuff we can compute upon. There's no collection of transistors or anything else that can possibly know all the states of anything else, and therefore, because there is only stuff in principle, the ontological and the epistemological constraints here collapse to the same thing as with metaphysical.
Now I understand you. So what you're meaning is that taking the ontological approach would collapse the epistemological, because the ontological approach applied to knowledge or to the technology itself would make this knowledge and this technology also infinitely relational. That is what you mean.
Partly, but also the technology we're using has infinite relations, and it can't exhaust the relations of anything else.
Yeah.
So a computer cannot, however good its predictive power, it can't exhaust all possible relations of the things it's trying to predict necessarily.
But would that really mean getting rid of the epistemic dimension, and wouldn't it on the other hand mean that wouldn't it on the contrary mean that they coincide?
Yes.
Because if you think if I ask for the definition of a thing, and you would say that I cannot define it by referring to all other objects, because there's an infinity of possible relations that it can uphold with all objects, possible and real. But that would also mean that you cannot define it, because what you would have to know in order to be able to define it would be to specifically list, like in a Leibnizian manner, all of those relations that it could engage in, and that is impossible for a finite intellect to do. So the argument, the epistemic argument for indeterminism, becomes identical with the ontological argument for indeterminism.
It is the same argument, but there is one major detail here, that the epistemological one favors subjective structures, and it centralizes centralizes the predicate structure on the subject, and it privileges the subject in order to make negative judgments about objects which are out of our reach. The other approach, the one that we are taking in TTT, is to say we turn this negative judgment about things into a positive one, in the sense that we do not say that they are inaccessible. Instead, we say they are in relation to us, but they are just partly in relation to us because they are infinite. And also because we are infinite, but no configuration of things can exhaust the entire infiniteness of the things involved, because any configuration of things is a contextual one or a situational one. So that means that only a few or some of the relations or the qualities, let's say, of each things and each subject get involved in that situation. So and this is the main argument of flat ontologies, of taking this hierarchy that privileges cognitive being and flattening everything down and decentralizing the statements about that privileged being, decentralizing it and trying to make them about everything, not just one subject that has immediate access to itself and from there on can know itself better than any other things, but to not exclude the possibility of things interacting with themselves, of things interacting with themselves contextually and finitely, and also to not exclude the possibility of things being inexhaustible by any other thing. So it might seem like it's what's the opposite of promoting?
Demoting.
So it might seem like it's demoting human subjects, but it's actually promoting every other thing to be just as relevant as human subject. And this, I don't know if this applies to science as much as it does for philosophy, but like the main tradition in philosophy for hundreds of years was to take the human subject as a privileged entity because it has this self-relation to itself, this self-knowing relation, and that means it knows itself better than the things surrounding it, and that means it can take what it knows about itself and then apply it in a hierarchical structure to all of the things that surround it. And then the approach of flat ontologies and TTT is to say the fact that we are finite doesn't say that things are inaccessible or that they are just negatively posited as some substance beyond our reach. It just means that they are infinitely complex and we are just in contextual relation to them.
So does this translate into the predictability of things? So you're saying, like, if I understood correctly, Razvan, the fact that two things are infinite doesn't, like, if I try to predict something about another object, and I can't predict it fully, it's not because my capacity to predict things is not enough to face that prediction. It's because also the other object is infinitely relational and thus unpredictable for any observer, even if I had the power to observe all the relations that it has?
Yes.
Okay. So I think it's like I've been thinking the whole time about like the Bayesian versus frequentist discussion, and I think this is pretty close to that, no? I mean, it's not a discussion really, but it's just two different approaches to look at probabilities. So basically,
I don't know the discussion.
So basically, the frequentist approach to statistics, the way I understand it, it kind of makes the like what you are when you talk about probabilities, you're actually talking about things like, for example, if you are throwing a dice, then you can tell the probability of the dice coming up in a certain number, and that is an estimation of the what will happen if you average over an infinite amount of repetitions of the event. But then if you apply those same statistics to other events which are not throwing a dice, but rather the probability that the human in the mecha will do a certain step or will sit down or will do whatever, and you're still thinking about it as if it was kind of a, if I repeat this situation infinitely many times, how many times will this person stand up or sit down or do this or that? And the Bayesian approach is more about talking about beliefs, not so much about the probability as this kind of universal thing of if I repeat infinitely many times, it will happen this many times, but rather thinking about if you say this has this probability to occur, you are saying my belief is that I am X% sure that this will occur. So basically, from what you are saying about things, if you like the idea that I can't predict something because I don't have the computational power to predict something, would be kind of a Bayesian thing. No, it would be like I don't have enough evidence about the other thing to be able to predict it. So my belief is never going to be 100%. While what you're saying is more like a frequentist thing. No, it's like the other thing, it in itself is so complex that if time was to repeat infinitely many times, or that event was going to repeat infinitely many times, it would vary because of how complex it is.
I think that's a nice approach, an alternative approach to describe it. Yeah.
So it is just on a side note, a comment, because Razwan initially wanted me to present something about Nicholas of Cusa, the medieval philosopher. And we have now reached a point where I can make one single comment by referring to him. So what's interesting is that he said, no thing is always all that it can be. So he meant by that of course everything is a realization of a potential, but no thing realizes all the potential that it has all the time, except for God. So the definition of God is the sole being that is all that it ever can be at the same time, all of the time. And that's just struck me as interesting. It's not really any consequences of it.
No, but I think that's a really nice parallel, because what I really like about Cusanus is that his this ontological standpoint that he has influences the way he sees mathematics, in the sense that for him full equality is never possible, especially when applied. So up until him, there were a lot of attempts to talk about God, and for Cusanus that is impossible, but there is some sort of approximation process that you can take in talking about greater things than yourself. But that influenced the development in mathematics of the concept of uneven equality, so incomplete equality, like the one being used in calculus or liminal mathematics, in which you approximate or you grow tangentially towards a limit, but you never reach it.
Yeah, like convergent infinite convergence theory.
Exactly, yeah. So you formalize it through through an equality sign, but that equality sign signifies an incomplete equality.
Yes.
And I think this is a really cool analogy for determinism, that we use determinism kind of like equality, but it's always an incomplete determinism.
Yes, that's a good point.